Good morning, everybody. My name is Lisa Sturdivant. I'm Assistant Research Professor here at George Mason University School of Public Policy and a researcher with the George Mason Center for Regional Analysis. And on behalf of Dean Ed Rhodes, the Dean here of the School of Public Policy, I am very happy to welcome you here this morning. Dean Rhodes is out at the Fairfax campus of George Mason at the request of the provost to attend a dress rehearsal for graduation. Otherwise, he would be here himself, pardon me, to welcome you. But we are very happy to co-host this Sustainable Installation Planning Conference with the National Capital Planning Commission. The School of Public Policy moved to this new building back in January 2011. And as many of you may know, most of the school was in the old Cannes department store next door. And we're very happy now to be under one roof and to be in this great building, this new space, part of the Arlington community. And in addition to the great classrooms and office space we have here, we're fortunate to have this wonderful auditorium and this meeting space, and we're delighted to open it up to our regional partners for conferences and events like this. Today's program, the Sustainable Installation Planning Conference, is part of the National Capital Planning Commission's speaker series and is bringing together planners, architects, DoD staff, economic development professionals, and others who understand the importance of comprehensive planning for DoD bases and installations. With more than 300,000 buildings and 2.2 billion square feet of office space, DoD's footprint is vast, and the federal presence here in our region, including the DoD presence, has always been critical to economic growth and sustainability to the Northern Virginia region and the greater Washington metropolitan area. Long-range master planning for military installations, creating plans so that bases and installations can evolve and change, is critically important here in our region as our economy is evolving as well. Our military bases and installations often create extensive spin-off development nearby, and comprehensive site planning can contribute positively to the region's development patterns and to the growth around these installations. Thoughtful planning is also a critical component to establishing synergies between DoD and the private sector, partnerships that will become ever more important as our economy evolves. And by focusing on sustainability and long-range planning efforts, DoD and our region can be positioned as leaders in energy, transportation, environmental, and economic sustainability. So the mission this morning is an important one, not only to DoD and the military and civilian staff who work on bases and installations, but this conversation about sustainable planning is also important to our region's overall economic growth and sustainability. So with that, I'd like to welcome you again to Founders Hall here at the Arlington campus of George Mason University. We have an impressive set of speakers lined up this morning. I look forward very much to hearing from them, and welcome again. I'd like to turn the program over now to Preston Bryant, Chairman of the National Capital Planning Commission. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Lisa, very much. And once again, thank you to George Mason University and its School of Public Policy for making these terrific facilities available for this very good crowd. My name is Preston Bryant, and I do have the pleasure of chairing the National Capital Planning Commission. And for those of you who are not overly familiar with the National Capital Planning Commission, let me give you a little bit of background. The NCPC is the federal government's central planning agency for all federal lands and buildings in the National Capital Region. The National Capital Region is suburban Maryland, D.C., and Northern Virginia. In Maryland, it's Montgomery and Prince George's. It is, of course, the district, and then the 4 counties in Virginia from Loudoun, Arlington, Fairfax, and Prince William. Our jurisdiction extends as far south as Quantico. In some parts, we are we have basically approval of policies. In other parts, we are, depends on the jurisdiction. In other areas, we are advisory. But we work in our advisory capacity very closely with agencies, whether it's Commerce or DoD or Interior or whatever the agency or the Secretariat might be. And our advisory role carries a great deal of weight. The commission itself has 12 members. The president has 3 appointments. The D.C. mayor and the D.C. council chairman both have appointments. And then there are designees for the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Interior. Bradley Provencha from Washington Headquarters Service is the Secretary of Defense's designee. If Secretary Panetta ever showed up, I would be very surprised. But Bradley very ably represents the Department of Defense. The range of our oversight, we have staff of about 45 architects, engineers, planners, urban planners, historic preservation professionals, and others. And our staff of 45 and our commission of 12 work very closely with improvements to federal lands and facilities. And that's big stuff and little stuff, whether it's running a utility line to a parking deck or adding a sixth wing to the Pentagon. If that were possible, you would have to work with the National Capital Planning Commission and our staff. Some of our projects, for example, the consolidation of the Department of Homeland Security, the $3.5 to $4 billion project in Anacostia at St. Elizabeth's historic campus. We are working hand in glove on that. There's a new $500 million African American History and Culture Museum that will be part of the Smithsonian on the Mall. That is a major project for us. The consolidation of many of the BRAC efforts, the closing of Walter Reed and the relocating to other facilities, whether it's at Bethesda Naval Hospital or at Fort Belvoir, are all projects that take up a great deal of our time. And then there are a host of everyday run-of-the-mill utility and other kinds of projects that we do as well. On a rolling kind of 5-year CIP, Capital Improvement Plan, the NCPC will see somewhere between $7 and $9 billion worth of capital projects just in the National Capital Region. A big part of that CIP over a 4 or 5 year period is defense-related, military installation-related improvements. Today's program here is intended to provide a high-level perspective and on-the-ground examples of planning of the next generation of military facilities. In the post-BRAC days, things are changing a lot here in the National Capital Region and its military facilities, Fort Belvoir being, I guess, the greatest example. DoD owns and manages more than 28 million acres and more than 2 billion square feet of space and over 300,000 buildings around the world. As you can imagine, their energy needs are pretty significant. And in 2010, the DoD budget, they spent $4 billion just on energy alone, powering their facilities. In the past decade, leadership at the department has recognized that energy efficiency and sustainability is extremely important and is integral even to their goals, not only to reduce cost, but to improve security. This effort by the Defense Department is in keeping with President Obama's Executive Order 13514, whereby he directed many agencies, all federal agencies, to work to improve economic, energy, and environmental performance. And part of that is reducing your energy use by 15% by 2015. To meet this ambitious goal, the department has placed a renewed effort on the role of comprehensive master planning to develop facilities. And I'll underscore again, in their commission under Bradley Provencha's leadership with DoD, we are building an ever more close working relationship with area military installations and the facilities planners to accommodate the growth, to make sure we're doing it right. We also work very closely with the host communities. Again, we are in 6 counties in and around D.C., between Maryland and Virginia. And counties just like Arlington and Fairfax and even Prince William and Loudoun are hosts to lots of federal facilities, military and non-military alike. And so we will work closely with the agencies and the facility owners and planners, the host communities, to work on things like transportation management plans, look at housing stock, and look at the economics, and look to better understand the economic development potential for military or for federal facilities in host jurisdictions. So we try to take a very comprehensive approach. More recently, getting back to DoD, more recently DOD's update of the Unified Facilities Criteria, which is a set of standards that apply the planning, design, construction, operation, and maintenance to all of its real property, is intended to institutionalize this new approach to facilities planning. So for that reason, we're excited to have this opportunity today, this forum, and we have a most distinguished panel of officials and experts to discuss how the department is moving forward on many of these efforts. To kick things off, I want to introduce Dr. Dorothy Rabine, who's Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations and Environment. And for the roughly 2 years that I have been chairing the National Capital Planning Commission, we have built a very, again, a very close relationship, Dr. Rabine and I and our staffs, again, with Mr. Provencher's great assistance. And we are working much more closely these days. Since being appointed in 2009, Dr. Rabine has been the driving force behind DOD's initiatives to inject innovation into the process of planning buildings and facilities. And so with that, we're pleased that she's here today, and I would like to welcome Dr. Rabine.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. This is my first time in this new building, this new public policy building. I went to public policy school myself at Berkeley, and in the 70s, and Berkeley's public policy school was and still is in a beautiful old Tudor house, designed by an English architect named Ernest Coxhead, who did a number of gorgeous structures on Berkeley campus and in the Bay Area. It was originally or at one time, the Beta Theta Pi house. That's the fraternity featured in the movie Animal House. But they took very good care of this house, and it was when Berkeley's public policy school was created in the late 60s, the dean, Aaron Wildowski, insisted on having his own separate building to house the public policy school. He said, we can't be part of we don't want to be part of a high-rise structure with a lot of other departments. I want our own facility. And so he negotiated for this gorgeous old Tudor house, and the faculty offices were in what had been bedrooms upstairs, and there were several fireplaces, and actually over one of the fireplaces in the main classroom in Latin, it said the motto of the school, and it's the motto of this public policy program as well. In Latin, there is no such thing as a free lunch. But that house had such an influence. It created such a wonderful learning environment that it was a very fundamental lesson in the importance of environment to learning and productivity. Preston gave you some of the statistics on DoD. We are a big presence wherever we are, nationwide and internationally. In terms of our built infrastructure, as he said, we have 300,000 buildings, 2.2 billion square feet of space. That's triple that of Walmart. 5 times that of GSA, the General Services Administration. I learned in preparing for this that we have 1.5 billion square feet of pavement. That's a really frightening number, and that actually is relevant to why we're here today. We also have a very large natural environment, 28 million acres of land on which we test and train. About half of that is land that we have with its Bureau of Land Management land, largely in the West, that we have withdrawn for military purposes. On that land, we are stewards of that land, and to the 420 threatened species that inhabit that land, some 40 of which are found only on military installations. So we have a big presence. And we do a lot of things extraordinarily well. And I want to contrast a couple of things that we do extraordinarily well, and then talk about our approach to master planning in recent years and layout of our bases, which I think has not been a model. But let me talk about two things that we do extraordinarily well, and one you read about all the time, and that DoD is an engine of technological innovation. We are the greatest engine of technological innovation ever created, and this goes back to our work with Eli Whitney in the early 1800s, leading to the system of interchangeable machine-made parts for musket production. So the American system of manufacturing that came out of Whitney's work in mass production of muskets. GPS, aircraft, radar, the internet. The internet came out of DARPA, the ARPANET. We do that extraordinarily well. Why do we do that so well? Because we are, if I had to capture it in a nutshell, we not only develop the technology, but we use it. We are the customer for the technology, so it has to be very, very good. We have supply and demand under one roof, if you will. No other federal agency has that, and I think that more than anything else explains why we're so effective. We are also we are extremely good at natural land management. If you talk to the Nature Conservancy, they will tell you that DoD is the best natural land manager in the federal government. Better than the Department of Interior, than the Forest Service, and I think there's a similar explanation, and that is that we use the land that we manage. We manage land for our own use, and so we are like a good rancher or farmer. We protect that land because it's all we're going to have, and we need to maintain it in a very, very good, in its natural habitat, in order for us to be able to train in that environment. And we take very good care of those threatened and endangered species because, in part, so as to preserve the natural habitat, but also so as to maintain our flexibility to train and test on these 28 million acres of ranges. So we do those two things extraordinarily well. We have not, by contrast, we have built some beautiful bases. We have 500 installations at 5,000 sites, and particularly if you go back to some of the older bases, like Fort Riley in Kansas, just beautiful, or West Point. Gorgeous buildings, installations, very, very well laid out. In recent decades, however, I think we did what America did more generally, which is we followed this suburban model of sprawl. We adopted the American model of suburban sprawl. And if you go on many of our bases, particularly the ones that were built or that expanded substantially after World War II, you will find them to be very sprawling, very auto-centric. You have to have a car to get around. Things are very spread out. We pave everything, huge numbers of parking lots. Saw a statistic that I believe it's Joint Base Lewis McChord, we have 70,000 parking spaces for a population that never exceeds 40,000 on a given day, and so that has been the model, just as it has been the model for American suburbia, and we segregate the uses, just zoning carried to an extreme with all of the residential separate from the administrative, from the industrial. Bases are like small cities. Some of them are the size of small cities, and we have zoned them like a lot of cities, suburban cities with very segregated uses. So So we have not done a great job in this area, and this came as an awakening to me. Early on in my job, I discovered Mark Gillum, who you'll hear from shortly, professor at University of Oregon, who also went to Berkeley, on the other side of the campus, the city planning department, which was a completely different culture from the public policy school, but one I have come to embrace. And Mark has written a wonderful book called America Town, about how the U.S. military projects power in other countries, on our bases in other countries, and our tendency to export that same sprawling nature of U.S. bases onto our foreign bases, and that's a huge problem in countries where land is very, very scarce and very, very precious. And reading his book was just a real awakening for me. His pictures of, for example, Kadena Air Force Base in Japan, where the aerial photograph of the town, the adjacent town, one very, very densely packed, lots of black on the picture, signifying buildings, very little white space in between, and then the aerial of the base next door, and huge, small amounts of black space for buildings and huge amounts of white space, indicating big streets and big parking lots and golf course, the golf course, of course, and that kind of a contrast it can be a problem. And I brought him in to work with us in Guam, where we're going to be sending a lot more Marines. And I saw firsthand there the issues. It's not a foreign country. Guam is the U.S., but there's a similar reaction to our desire to take over more land, particularly where there are culturally, historically significant artifacts. Everything that Mark said about foreign bases is true for many of our U.S. bases as well. This same problem with sprawl, with lack of a center. So he has been working with Jerry Zeckert, the head of the Army Corps of Engineers Master Planning, and a group within the services and my office to revamp our master plan, to come up with a guidance for installations in doing master planning. The military we are planners. We are a command and control organization. We are very top down. We like doctrine and we like plans. We have not had a good master planning process, however. So master plans for military bases have been done locally, in contrast to the management of ranges, which reflects a very high level of involvement by the operators, by the operational people. The master planning process has not had that kind of higher level oversight. It's been locally done. There hasn't been a good planning process, and there hasn't been a philosophy behind that process, and that's been reflected in the sprawl. So we created this process, worked together for 18 months, and have finished this new guidance for Unified Facilities Criteria, which is our word for a code, installation master planning. We're releasing it today. We got all of the approvals. Mark is going to talk about it, but let me just give you someone said to me recently, well, this is the new urbanism. I had never heard that term before, but I think for those of you who are familiar with that term, I think maybe that's what this is. I think of it as Mark and and Jerry's vision, but I think it is consistent with a new urbanism approach. And let me just read you just headings to give you a feel for it. Well, let me describe what's in a press release. So, advocacy for walkable, pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods, mixed-use development, sustainable energy-efficient communities, higher density buildings, healthier living conditions for residents. Underlying each principle is the primary goal of helping people live fuller lives through their community while preserving and reinforcing the installation's capability to support the defense mission. So Mark is going to talk about this in more detail. What I want to reinforce, though, that for us, this is about doing our mission job better. It isn't about, Preston talked about our work in the energy area, and I do a lot of, I spend a lot of my time on improving DoD's facility energy performance. What I just was out in Colorado early this week speaking to the World Renewable Energy Forum. We have set a commitment of doing 3 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's the equivalent of 3 nuclear power plants on our installations by 2020. We are spending $1 billion next year to make our buildings more energy efficient. We're not doing this to be green. We're doing it because we spend $4 billion a year on energy, and that's too much. And we're doing it because we provide direct support to the warfighter from our military installations. We fly UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. We stage humanitarian and homeland defense missions from our installations. They aren't used just for training and deployment as they were historically. Increasingly, they're used to provide direct support for the warfighter. We are dependent on a commercial electric power grid that is not all that reliable, and so we need to find ways to make our installations more energy secure, and part of that is renewable energy combined with advanced microgrid and storage technologies. So for us, energy efficiency is all about doing our job more effectively and at a reduced cost, and similarly, the kinds of the approach laid out in our new guidance on master planning. It's about a higher quality of life for families, but it's also about doing things more efficiently so that we can preserve land for future missions. It's about spending less on infrastructure when infrastructure is associated with sprawl. So this is we think it will improve quality of life, but for us it's also about doing our jobs better. Enough from me. Let me introduce formally Mark Gillum, who together with Jerry Zeckert is the brains behind our new guidance. Mark is, I think I've told you most of what I have. Well, let me tell a little bit else about Mark. He was an undergraduate at the University of Kansas, got a degree in architecture there, a PhD from Berkeley in both architecture and city planning, and he's a retired Air Force officer. He was in the Air Force Reserve. So I don't know that you could do what Mark does and not have been in the military. I think to have the credibility to be as critical of us as, frankly, as he has been, I think you need to have seen it from the inside, both to get the insight and to get the credibility. He is on the faculty at the University of Oregon. He has a terrific consulting practice called Urban Collaborative. He's been an advisor to me and somebody whose vision I think is important. So Mark, welcome.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robine, for that generous introduction. It's great to be here, great to be at a university where you can actually walk around from hotels and restaurants. That's very different in some places, and it's great to be in a nice new building. What I'd like you to do for a second is just think about some of the pressing issues that we were facing as a nation, as a Department of Defense in 1986. So what were some of the pressing issues? I'm going to switch the screen over, and we'll address some of those. So some pressing issues. What were some of those, do you think, in 1986? Just toss out some ideas. Pressing issues. Libya, okay, so it's a war. What else? Energy, right. So folks were interested in energy. In fact, at the University of Oregon, we have a Professor Charlie Brown who wrote a great book around that time called Sun, Wind, and Light. Amory Lovins, very engaged at the Rocky Mountain Institute for over 30 years thinking about energy. That was a big topic back then. What about sustainability? Was that even a word back then? Seeing some nods, not really. Yes, ma'am. Containing the growth. Lots of growth happening. And housing the growth that's occurring. A lot of ideas were happening in 1986. A street like this was built long before 1986, but it was governed by a set of rules that were developed in 1986. And that was the Unified Facilities Criteria for Installation Master Planning. Now you'd think this idea of creating great places is nothing new. Just look around here and around Alexandria and on Capitol Hill. We've been planning great places for a long, long time. In fact, when I teach about and critique new urbanism, really the idea is it's old urbanism. It's learning about how we've created places that work for our various missions. But somewhere we went awry in making those places, and we create streets like this. This case happens to be Joint Base Lewis McChord. This is the main street that runs through the heart of the installation. Right here, there's not a lot of traffic because it's off the peak hour, but during peak hour, it can take a half hour to go a mile, which is crazy. Now, I don't know if you'd consider this a great street, but I ask folks to look at this street, and oftentimes they say, oh, this is not a very good street. How is it that we're doing this? On one side, we have a warehouse. I especially like the sidewalk on the bottom right, just a little bit of leftover asphalt. The grocery store is hidden behind the trees on the left. But the main street, and this is what we have. But when we talk to folks, they'd love to have something like this. A street that certainly accommodates cars. We're not going to get rid of cars. That accommodates buses, that accommodates bikes and pedestrians. The American Planning Association calls this complete streets. But it also accommodates development. It becomes a great street that's a magnet for more sustainable development. But the problem is creating a place like this is very challenging. And certainly I'm not the first one to identify this challenge. Jonathan Levine wrote a great book called Zoned Out that says we can't create these places like his transit-oriented station right there because we have a lot of rules that are in the way. Rules that don't allow for a mixture of uses, rules that don't allow for complete streets, rules in fact that don't even allow for street trees, which is amazing. And as a result, we create places that we really don't like so much. But more importantly, we create places that don't function very effectively in terms of energy efficiency and in terms of sustainability, both social sustainability and environmental sustainability. So the rules are really driving us to a process that's not that effective. And that's what we found, and I've just been very thankful that I've been able to be a small part of this process. Jerry Zeckert at the core, and you can raise your hand, Jerry, really got us engaged in thinking about how to make a difference. Jerry and I have been at this for about, I think, 15 years or so, lecturing and talking to folks about doing a different model. We have a recipe for development that supports low-density, automobile-oriented growth. We have a lot of buildings, we have a lot of parking lots, we have a lot of places, and if we change that recipe, we certainly could make better places. But the recipe is run by a set of rules. This is the cover of what says 1 March 2005. This is what we were asked to update. But actually underneath the cover is a document dated from 1986. It's an old Army tech manual that says how we should do planning. Nowhere in it does it talk about energy efficiency, even though in the mid-'80s energy efficiency was a very important concept. Certainly the word sustainability doesn't even show up. The idea of complete streets, the idea of walkability, the idea of pedestrian orientation doesn't show up at all in this document. Certainly it was out of date. Running an organization with a document that's over 2 decades old seems to be a mistake. So thankfully, Dr. Robine and her staff really did a great job in pushing forward an update to this. And you might not think it's much, but announcing the fact that this is a new policy released today is quite significant and done in just 18 months. There's still groups that are working on policies now 2, 3, 4, 5 years later to try and get things done. So it's really a testament to your leadership in this process to update a policy. It's fairly significant. So what we're going to do this morning is I'm going to take you inside the UFC. So you actually know, what is this policy about? I'm going to start a bit about theory, kind of show some images that Dr. Robine was talking about in a narrative, and then I'll go through the content of what's actually in there, and then show you some cases where we've applied it. We just didn't dream this up, and we've actually been prototyping this idea across the DoD to make sure that it's something that actually works. So we're going to kind of walk through this. I'll take about 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. And then what we're going to do is have the panel come up to the front. We'll have some discussion among the panel, and then we're going to have a Q&A session with you. So hopefully you'll pay some attention here so you can ask some fairly critical questions, because this is always something that we can learn from and make a movement for. So inside the new UFC, and Chris, I think we can get the lights turned down up front. We're going to talk a bit about theory. So going to go over what are the attributes of sprawl, low-density, auto-oriented development, and we're going to kind of talk about those. Now there might be more, there might be less, but I'll talk about 7, and then there's some costs associated with that model, and then discuss briefly what regulation's role happens to be. So that's kind of the theory that I'll cover first. So here we go with the 7 attributes of sprawl. Number 1, the installations that we've created are auto-focused. Now, most of you probably drove here today. This is actually at Aviano Air Base in northern Italy, and they wanted to create kind of a replica of a small, walkable Italian town. Didn't do a very good job. In fact, the only way to get there is by driving, and you have to drive quite a ways, 30 minutes to 60 minutes from the military family housing to this shopping area. Now, what they did do is they cloaked the building in this kind of quasi-Italian vernacular. And when I've interviewed folks over there, they said, well, look, we've responded to the local culture. I said, well, fake stucco walls is not really appropriate. And in fact, the Italian architects I talked to were wondering, why did they copy a model that's over 400 years old for a building built in this last decade? What they didn't understand was the underlying morphology, or the network of creating places that are more effective. So we have an auto-focused environment, whether it's in Italy or the United States. We have places that are heavily paved. This is an 86-acre chunk of Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. 36 acres in black there. That black is parking lots and paving and roads. When we did peak hour studies of the parking lots, they were less than half occupied. Now, certainly the parking spaces right next to the front doors of buildings, those were high in demand, but nobody wanted to walk more than 2 minutes from their parking space. So what we have is a situation where we're building more and more parking and creating places that need a lot of space. So if we have an auto-focused environment that's abundantly paved, that means the buildings are widely spaced. This is looking at Kadena Air Base. This is called a figure ground drawing. Alan Jacobs from UC Berkeley wrote a wonderful book called Great Streets, where he kind of mastered this idea of just looking carefully at one item. The one item we're looking at here in black, those are buildings. We can see on the bottom right, that's Kadena Cho. On the top left, that's the American Air Base. I don't even need to draw the line of the installation board. You can kind of see that. And that idea of we don't have enough room on our installations came forward right here when I was in a helicopter with the installation planner. He said, hey, we don't have any room for growth. We need more land. I was like, well, Javad, you've got plenty of land. It's just the rules that have been set up forcing you into a different pattern. So thinking about that spacing is pretty significant. Now, sometimes there isn't paving between buildings, and then what they do is they fill it up with grass. And it has to be pretty green to look good. And this here at Aviano Air Base, I asked them, how on earth do they keep that grass so green? Well, they actually imported Scott's fertilizer to make sure that grass was green. They have 400 square feet of grass for every dormitory occupant there. Rarely is all that grass used, but it's just filling up that space in between buildings, which something has to be there. Number 5, these places are increasingly franchised. Now, this can be a good thing and a bad thing. My brother works for Walmart, and a few years ago, he asked me, he's at the headquarters down in Bentonville, and he asked me if I needed a job. They need architects for Walmart. I said, Brett, how many shades of gray really are there? You don't really need architects. But the idea is that Walmart, the exchange, which is formerly the Army and Air Force Exchange Service, the Navy Exchange, they can be great partners in building great places because they come with their own checkbook. We call this other people's money, so it's good to use other people's money, whether it's Walmart or Chili's or Burger King, whoever can come to the table. But when they come to a table where there are no rules, they pretty much do the same pattern. Here, this is at Osan Air Base where they're building a several 100,000 square foot exchange. One story, as you can see, in Osan, in heavily populated Korea, in the Pyeongtaek area, running out of land. And in fact, they were running out of land there. And what they decided is they needed to build some new family housing. The only thing they could think of was to annex more land, destroy part of a village, and build some housing towers at the edge of the installation. In the meantime, they're building this one-story building. It's not rocket science to say, couldn't we just build all of the housing on top of that building and build two-story courtyard housing, which would have been a great typology, and then everybody could walk to where they needed to go? Couldn't do that because the rules weren't there to support it. So they built this, they annexed the village, and when we went and toured the village, they wouldn't even let us out of the car because the locals were so upset about this pattern of annexation. So there's a geopolitical cost at work. But working with our franchise partners is using their money to create great places, and I think there are great opportunities for that. Up at Misawa Air Base in northern Japan, this kind of idea of haphazard order came through when the F-16 pilot, who was the commander of the installation, said, we create bases that are just haphazard. Why don't we redesign them from a human factors point of view? Dr. Galen Kranz at UC Berkeley, really kind of a pioneer in the idea of human factors architecture, thinking about creating places for the way that we operate, the way that we function. Well, he said, you guys are designing bases for auto factors engineering. You're just creating places to support the car, and in the end, we have this random order. Oftentimes, it's what Dan Solomon, an architect in San Francisco, calls train wreck planning. Think of the trains crashing, and that's what you end up with. There really is no order other than disorder. Dr. Robine talked about the idea of segregation. This is the 7th issue. We create very segregated installations. This is the land use map for an installation in Japan, where we have yellow for housing, red for commercial, blue for mission. You can't imagine how long the planners argued over what color the airfield should be. Should we color it brown or white or gray? In the end, that really doesn't matter. What happens is this forces largely compatible uses apart because many of our leaders like to see clearly colored areas. These land use maps certainly have legitimacy. We don't want to put child development centers in schools right next to weapon storage areas, but we want to think about what's appropriate and what's inappropriate in a broader way. And in fact, we've gotten rid of the land use map altogether. It's not a requirement anymore as part of the new UFC because we found that these just aren't helpful in terms of planning. They're just too coarse. So those are the attributes of sprawl. There may be more, there may be less, and those come at a cost. So we're going to go over a few of the costs, and one of them is a transportation impact. Simply because we spread things out and we force folks into the automobiles, they have to drive a lot. But it's really no different than driving across the United States. The average family of 4 in the United States drives over 30,000 miles a year in typical sprawling neighborhoods. If they live in more compact neighborhoods, think of this area or Alexandria or where I'm from in Berkeley, California, families drive about 15,000 miles a year. The difference is not that they're anti-car or anything of that nature. The difference is the environment is built in a way that supports multimodal transportation options. I had to pay a premium for a 100-year-old house in Eugene, Oregon that was falling apart because it was within walking distance of campus. And as a result, my family of 4, we drive about 12,000 miles a year, significantly less than everybody else. But we do drive an SUV, so maybe that's not so great, but it takes the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts around. But the idea is simply thinking about giving people choices in their environments. And they'll make the choices that are more effective for them because of those transportation impacts. Now let's say you don't agree with this, well, that's not really that important. I don't really care about those transportation impacts. Well, there's another problem associated with sprawl, and that's air quality. We have a number of non-attainment zones across the DoD, trying to reduce our emissions, trying to use TDM models to do that because we need to improve our air quality. According to the EPA, if you drive, that is your #1 source of daily pollution. Now, you might recycle newspapers or use a nice recycled bag to go to the grocery store, but that's fluff if you're driving every day. So the idea is to think seriously about a commitment to air quality means we have to think seriously about reducing our transportation impact. Now, you might say, well, look, it's a very clear day here, Mark. Our air quality is very nice, so I don't really care about air quality impacts. Okay, so you're not concerned about transportation or air quality. Well, there's another issue coming around, climate change. The DoD has been doing a lot of thinking about national security impacts related to climate change, and this is pretty significant. Now, it seems to me that the Earth is getting a little bit warmer. In Oregon, we're seeing a pretty alarming melting of our glaciers. Really, the debate is, why is the thing heating up? Is the sun getting closer to the Earth? Is it Mother Nature doing something crazy? Is it human impacts causing this thing? And that's where the debate happens. And really, I have no idea. I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but I do know climate change is happening, and there are impacts, and those impacts can affect national security. So we need to think about our role. And if we think about the role of the built environment, it's a significant contributor. Buildings contribute over 2/3 of carbon emissions, and getting to and from buildings about 1/3 of carbon emissions. So the work that we do as planners, landscape architects, and architects has a significant contribution to climate change. Now you might say, look, Mark, I don't agree in climate change. As science is unsettled, those scientists have lied about the data, so it's not a big deal. Well, okay. If that's true, well, maybe you care about the pocketbook. And no matter what Americans say about believing in climate change or believing in air quality or shopping effectively, they act on their pocketbook. It's really down to the economics. And we are seeing now with gas over $4 a gallon, people making changes to their driving behaviors. They're driving less, walking more, taking transit more. We're seeing a sharp uptick in transit ridership in Eugene simply because of the price of gas. And that's how people make changes. So what we need to do then is figure out how can we create environments that allows that to happen. Now you might say, well, look, I'm a professor at the university and I make plenty of money, or I'm a government employee, I've got a great job, so I really don't care about fiscal impacts. Well, then maybe in the end, if you're concerned about planning, that's all we can talk about. And if we think about planning, we think about the impact of this low-density automobile-oriented model, and all those other impacts maybe you agree with or don't agree with. But in this case, what this does is it uses our land pretty inefficiently. The area for a pedestrian, about 4 square feet. The area for a car, over 1,400 square feet. So the more cars we have, the more area we need to dedicate to the landscape for those cars. And those cars are usually, the efficiency ratio of a car on a basis is 4 to 14%. Is how often it's used over the course of a year. So generally these cars are just sitting, parked somewhere, and we have to take up land. That land that we take up then is land that can't be used for mission. It can't be used for quality of life. It can't be used for natural environmental benefits because it's being used for the car. So those are some impacts associated with the sprawl that we're seeing at our installations. But what's driving those are regulations, the rules that support all of this. So we have rules for master planning, we have rules for area planning, we have rules for anti-terrorism, and oftentimes folks tell me, well, Mark, we can't do anything differently because, well, those are the rules. And the good news is the rules are changing, and thinking about that changing pattern of regulation can certainly help us think about a different pattern of development. Regulation certainly has a role not only in the Department of Defense, but across America when we have zoning rules and land use rules that force us into patterns of development that are energy inefficient and land use intensive, when certainly we can start to think about more rules. So the idea of creating a UFC has been essential to start to structure a conversation about a new planning approach. Because what happens, if we don't do that conversation together, we talk separately. We have our anti-terrorism experts, we have our site planning experts, our master planning experts. In the military, we call this the stovepipes. They're all in their stovepipes and they don't speak together, and we get these sprawling installations as a result. And what we have in the building design and planning process is the Tower of Babel, where they're all speaking different languages, and they don't come to common ground because they don't understand one another. What the UFC is trying to do is to create a common language, to avoid this Tower of Babel problem, where in the end we can speak fairly straightforward about what are the planning strategies we need to implement, and how can we do that in an effective way. So how do we do that? We do that through the Unified Facilities Criteria. That becomes our pattern book in using kind of the Chris Alexander terminology. And I'm going to go through the content of this. There are 10 strategies. We'll talk about the process and products, and then discuss how we're actually implementing this through an education and training program. So the meat of my presentation is really about these 10 strategies. And that's really a key difference between the new UFC and the old one, is the old one just dove right into data management. 26 out of 63 pages really dealt with data management. The new one dives in with theory, thinking carefully about what do we want to achieve when we write these rules. So we have 10 strategies. The first one is sustainable planning, and that's supported by a series of tactics in kind of military speak or objectives. One is compact infill development, where we start to build more compactly. This little installation, the Natick Soldier System Center, a new master plan they're working on, to infill rather than build out, to add housing onto the installation so that folks can walk to where they work. And lo and behold, that actually comes at a benefit. When we look at the energy efficiencies of compact infill development, we took a look at the master plan energy requirement, and you can see 100% of the requirement over about 21 million kilowatt hours. If we just apply sustainable planning approaches, we can reduce that by about 35%. So when we're talking about trying to go towards net zero, which is somewhat problematic because it's appropriate in some places, not appropriate in other places, here at Natick, we're not going to be able to get to net zero, but we're going to be able to get pretty close if we add renewable energy generation. We're going to get to about 28.3% of the original requirement. And that's through sustainable planning approaches. So we can directly see the correlation between master planning and energy efficiency. Another tactic in support of that strategy is transoriented development here at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. They're working on a plan to improve roadways and add shuttles and connect to the Honolulu light rail system to start to give people transit options. And this isn't optional. We have an executive order telling us that we need to do this. Horizontal and vertical mixed uses, another very important tactic. Horizontal, think within a 10-minute walk, you can go from where you work to where you live, to where you eat, to where you shop, on foot or by bike. That's not too difficult. What's been more challenging is vertical mixed use. Creating buildings that have a ground floor use that's different than the uses on top. It's been done in a few cases. This is at Fort Belvoir, not too far from here. Ground floor retail with townhouses above. These are two-story townhouses for families. And lo and behold, this is pretty popular housing, in part because there aren't any yards that families need to take care of. With this high operations tempo, that can be a bit challenging. But folks that live there can walk to the shop, they can get a gallon of milk. In fact, our partner, The Exchange, has a little corner market here that does pretty well. They've had some other retail that hasn't done so well, but the idea is you can have a Starbucks, you can have, basically the common stuff you see out here, very unusual. This is the only one in the entire Department of Defense inventory that's like this. And one of the reasons why is because we're mixing money. Whose money is it? Is it appropriated funding, non-appropriated funding? Who's going to pay for the extra columns? Who maintains the roof? It becomes more of a challenge than an opportunity. And the UFC tries to see this as an opportunity to use the resources that are out there and to leverage with our partners those opportunities. Connecting our street networks is another important component of sustainable planning. The old pattern like this out in Omaha, Nebraska, I think on the left side, that's kind of Dodge Avenue going through the middle, and where we have locals, arterials, and collectors, and those all work together to create a pattern of traffic. So the only way to get from your house to the school is to go through the cul-de-sac, down the local street to the collector, to the arterial, and then to the school. And odds are families aren't going to let their kids walk along that arterial, so then there's a bus system set up, and you know the pattern. The idea is let's think about a gridded network. And our first president was also one of our first planners in Alexandria. He laid out the plan for Alexandria, George Washington. And what did he do? Well, he used a very straightforward grid, and then Thomas Jefferson applied that grid across the continental United States. And the idea is it's a very straightforward approach. But the grid wasn't invented in the United States. It's been used across the world as a way to create connections for people that can get from place to place on foot or by bike or by bus or by train. But the idea here is looking into that pattern. Now, it doesn't need to be a dress-right, dress-perfect grid, but the idea is that we have connectivity. There's actually a security benefit in this, in that we're not stuck in a dead-end loop when we have an anti-terrorism issue that comes up. So creating a connected grid network is an important concept in support of sustainable planning. Low-impact development, many of you are well aware of this. A lot of strategies thinking about stormwater runoff and mitigation. Certainly our parking lots, that is a crazy number, 1.5 billion square feet of paving. Wow. Yards, oh man. And what do you do with that? Most of those parking lots don't have trees like this. This is out at Joint Base Lewis McChord in a prototype, what we call a car park, where we integrate the stormwater treatment into the parking lot itself. In this case, between every bay of parking, there's a swale with trees and landscape that can accommodate some of the stormwater drainage. But the idea is thinking about low-impact development from a more holistic point of view. Because now if we have parking lots with integrated landscaping, the trees can shade the paving, and we might have a 10 to 15% increase in the lifespan of that paving. Also, we've reduced the heat island effect, which can reduce the air conditioning requirements in our buildings that are adjacent to those parking areas. So starting to think more holistically is really the role of planning, and low-impact development supports a strategy of sustainable planning. This is a tough one. multi-story construction. I mean, you see it all around you here, but you think, what's wrong with that? This is actually one of those bases that I think is one of the most beautiful historic bases. This is Fort Sill in Oklahoma with a wonderful historic core, multi-story buildings, narrow wings. Everything we talk about has been done at Fort Sill. It's been done at Fort Riley, at Fort Leavenworth, at F.E. Warren and Cheyenne. But what happened over the years is we had individual projects supported by individual proponents, and those individual projects weren't necessarily big enough to make bigger buildings, so we ended up with a lot of one-story buildings scattered around the landscape. And those one-story buildings get their parking, their infrastructure lines to them, now they have their anti-terrorism buffer around them, and it compounds the problem. What we've done is we've carried the error through the math problem, and that error continues to grow and continues to expand our installations. In order to create multi-story buildings, we need to bring together users that can be collaborative. And fortunately, we're starting to see more of that now. But we're simply learning from history. This was a pretty controversial tenet, this idea of creating more narrow wing buildings. To me, if you just go and look at the historic military installations that people love to work in, well, they're pretty narrow. They were built between the 1920s and 1930s. Beautiful buildings. We actually applied that model in a test at Ellsworth Air Force Base in Rapid City, South Dakota, where we were going to a green administration building compared to the more typical admin building. So there are a lot of strategies for green, a lot of things we can do from a technology point of view, but the first thing we want to do is reduce our energy consumption. And to do that, we need to bring in natural lighting. To do that, we need to have more narrow buildings, daylight shelves, and the like. And we need to move away from the wide building footprint model. So the idea, you can see the typical model of wide wings, fixed windows, not much daylighting, active HVAC system, and the cost in terms of energy, over 20 kilowatt hours per square foot from a study in 1996. And more recently, LEED silver median buildings about 18.6 kilowatt hours per square foot. But if we go to full-bore, full-on green buildings, we can reduce that to just over 10 kilowatt hours per square foot. But it means we need to change the shape of our buildings. And as it turns out, this has been a very effective building. It started out as an office building, then it became an education center, then it became a call center. It's been incredibly flexible. And our productivity rates are pretty high in there because people like to work where they can look out a window. So the idea of creating more narrow wings is a strategy that supports this idea of sustainable planning. So sustainable planning is the key and number one strategy that we're looking at, but there are a lot of other strategies that are important. There are 9 others, and I'll go through those a little bit quicker. The second one is resource preservation from a natural, historical, and cultural point of view. This is something I would add to the list that the DoD has done a pretty decent job at. We identify these resources and we look to preserve those as best as possible. This is looking at the historic Fort Lewis, now Joint Base Lewis-McChord, designed by Olmsted, one of the country's greatest landscape architects, thinking about that preservation piece. And now we're looking at preserving that area. And wouldn't you know it, but the places where people want to work, the highest in-demand places are those that are in the historic core. Narrow wing buildings, operable windows, walkable to everywhere they can go. So learning from that pattern of history and preserving those resources, whether it's historic or natural or cultural, is important. Certainly in today's day and age, we got to think about defensibility, and defensible planning is really nothing new. It predated Khobar Towers in 1996. Certainly it predated 9/11. But the idea here is we identify our critical infrastructure. There's a Defense Critical Infrastructure Program that tells us what that is, and we try and make sure that we can continue to operate our mission effectively. We've layered on to that anti-terrorism standards, and you guys see that all across the Washington, D.C. area, from bollards and berms to try and set back our buildings from where the target is. Fortunately, there's been some updates to the rules that I think are going to be a little bit more helpful. But the idea of creating defensible installations is certainly something that planning has a big role in. There's a theory of crime prevention through environmental design that's been around a long time as well. Defensible Planning, a book by Oscar Newman, talks a lot about this, where we look to create natural surveillance opportunities. We look to create territorial control because there just aren't enough police to keep track of everything. So we create an environment that can support more defensible communities, and that's an important strategy. A new one that we've integrated is this idea of healthy community planning. Many of you, maybe you walked here, you took transit here, which is very good, and in fact, from a planning point of view, that can contribute to healthier communities. Certainly there are a lot of things that planning can address. What we eat, that's certainly we can address that. But one thing we can do is create communities that are a bit more walkable. TRICARE, which is the military insurance program, health insurance basically, they spend over $1 billion a year in healthcare costs related to obesity. So this is a significant issue. So thinking about ways we can address that is getting people out walking a little bit more. That means we have to have environments for that walking to happen. It doesn't just happen naturally. One of the things that's sad for us to look at installations is the disconnected sidewalk network. And how are you going to walk if you have a disconnected sidewalk network? Oftentimes we'll go places and folks will tell us, well, look, boy, it's in Colorado. We're not going to walk around here. Oh, it's in Florida. It's hot. We're not going to walk around here. It's in Eugene. It rains. We're not going to walk around here. There's always some excuse why people aren't going to walk. And in fact, at the Natick Soldier Systems Center, when we looked at moving the parking to the perimeter of the installation, folks would have about a 4-minute walk from the perimeter to the heart of the installation. And there was some grumbling about that. But the commanding general, he would not have any of that. He said, look, I worked in the Pentagon, and I had to walk a lot farther than that just to get from the parking lot to the front door, and then from the front door to my office was even farther. So the idea of walkability is nothing that serious. But thinking about how to create a more effective network is a key. Another strategy, this is not that new, is focusing planning at the area development level. Think of a quilt, and a quilt has a series of pieces, and those pieces are brought together. In a military installation, the whole installation is like the quilt. The pieces are these districts. You might have a west side, or a north side, or a downtown, or a historic core. Those districts need a plan, and those plans are called area development plans. In the private sector, we call them neighborhood plans or sub-area plans, but it's actually getting to detailed planning. And this is a significant difference in the new UFC compared to the old one. The old one just kind of focused on planning, and it was land use planning. That's about all you saw were some land use maps, where they're starting to think about these red circles or walkability circles, where people can walk within 5 minutes from a parking area to the main industrial core of the installation. So thinking about area development planning is pretty significant, and actually doing real planning rather than just data analysis. Another controversial piece was, well, how do we actually regulate this? So we're moving more towards a model, and now in the UFC it's called form-based planning, where we actually create a plan based on a sustainable form. This follows the theory of form-based codes, where we actually create a code to do this. Many cities across the U.S. have adopted this model. But just think about how tall our buildings need to be, where they need to be sited along the landscape, creating a vision first, creating a plan, and then writing codes to follow that plan, rather than doing it the opposite direction. So here at Joint Base Lewis-McChord, there is a vision for in-town or on-base housing at the core of the installation. So that's kind of the vision. And then you create some rules. Here's the illustrative plan that shows typically how we'd illustrate that. The parks down the middle that you saw in the image, the browner buildings or mixed use or stacked buildings, and then the apartments around the edge. But we're not quite sure if the actual builder, and in this case we're using other people's money, which is a great thing. They're going to build all this, so we're not sure if they're going to build it exactly the way we laid it out. So underneath of that is what we call the regulating plan. Think of a land use plan on steroids. Certainly we still address uses. We don't want a weapon storage area in here, but we're a little bit more flexible. That band on the bottom, the plumb band on the bottom, those required mixed use. Ground floor or something, upper floor or something else. Then towards facing the park, those are required 3-story townhomes. And then out at the perimeter, that can be anything the guy wants to do as they develop. There's some red lines in there that identify where parking can and cannot go. And the thick black lines, those are build-to lines. So rather than setting back, we're saying we're requiring you to build to a frontage, to define that park space, to define the front street, and then from there have at it. The most interesting feature here, the developer had sunk several $100,000 into planning housing out at the edge of the installation, and we said there's an opportunity here for in-town housing. We're going to rewrite the rules. They abandoned their plans for that housing at the edge and built this housing even really before the master plan was dry. And that is now some of the most successful housing at Joint Base Lewis-McChord. And it was done with really without any military construction funding at all. It was all other people's money, and they built the park for us as well. And the architect said that it was the form-based plan that helped them do that, because they didn't have to spend time redesigning the site plan. They could focus in on design effectively. And there's some benefits there. Families that are living within walking distance or biking distance, we know empirically that they're going to drive less, over 11 million miles a year for families that get to live in that new housing. Collectively, that's going to result in about 13 million pounds of carbon not emitted. But the big number here was the per family savings. Families that get to live in the downtown core are going to save about $1,500 a year in gas, oil, and tires. We're assuming they're still going to have a car. You know, the AAA rate of over $6,000 a year per family per car, we're going to assume that. We're just going to assume they're going to drive less because we know empirically that will be the case. And we found room for a bunch of new homes on the installation in support of future growth. But really the ultimate objective was to make sure there was room for the mission. And that's understanding the importance value of land and understanding that mission so that growth can occur in the cantonment area, not in range and training land. Before they started the update to their master plan, they had looked to expand into range and training land. And I don't know about here in Washington, D.C., but in the state of Washington, you're not getting any more land for Joint Base Lewis-McChord. So the idea is we need to be effective managers and users of the land that we have to support our mission. Now, we can't just think of districts alone in isolation. Those districts are connected. They're connected by a series of networks. Transportation networks, certainly, and those had been addressed in the old UFC, but we're adding to that pedestrian networks, green infrastructure or open space networks, utility networks, security networks. So we make sure they're connected together like the street network plan at Joint Base Lewis-McChord. And we're abandoning some of the transportation terminology of locals, collectors, and arterials, and we're talking about types of streets, from alleys all the way up to boulevards and multi-way boulevards, because people understand that kind of terminology. So we think about the networks as well. Somewhat controversially, we've also been thinking about capacity. A few years ago, folks said, well, we don't need any capacity. We're not going to be building anything. Well, as it turns out, we do need to think about our capacity. There might be another round of BRAC, it's hard to say, but what we do know is things change all the time. And there's always somebody looking for a space to grow. This is at Fort Hunter Liggett in Central California, a little old reserve base that was going to be closed, and now it's seen significant redevelopment. In support, there's a historic mission there by Julia Morgan, one of the best architects, I think, ever. And the idea of preserving that history but allowing for growth, you can see down towards the bottom a whole new pattern of a new town center based largely on Paso Robles, which is a great place. But thinking about creating capacity for development, the town center there is kind of where those yellow squares are. Along Infantry Boulevard, there's some little gray buildings, and those little buildings, the idea, let's see if this thing works. These little guys here we need to define that street, to create a more walkable street. There was no program for those buildings, but now they're under design for 3 new barracks that they didn't understand, they didn't know they were going to get, but now they found a site and they're going to follow that plan. There's also a new pattern now for a hotel that's going to be built using other people's money in this area, privatized lodging, to help shape those areas. So we're using the resources that are still out there, that are still coming our way, and we're thinking about that idea of capacity. The 9th strategy, and we're almost done with the strategies, facility standardization. This is a very important concept that can get carried away a bit. Here we have a standard company ops facility at Fort Lewis in 2005, and in 2007 another standard, and you can see a significant difference in these standards. Standards seem to be changing all the time. What the UFC says is standards are good in terms of identifying the sizes of areas you need. If you have 10,000 soldiers, and whether you're in Washington State or whether you're in Arkansas, you need a fitness center, probably so many square feet to accommodate those 10,000 soldiers. Makes a ton of sense. Also, we standardize the relationships. Where the rooms go, it makes sense that if you're going to have a basketball here, you need the bathrooms here, so kind of bubble diagram relationships. But what we don't want to do is standardize the actual building. Create the same building that you build in Washington that you build in Arkansas. So we want to move away from the idea of standard floor plans and become much more flexible while understanding the standardization of requirements and relationships. Easier said than done, though, because we have folks that are very interested in creating standard floor plans and applying those at every location. So that's still a challenge. Probably the biggest challenge is the last strategy, and that's moving away from programming first and then give us a plan to actually planning first. We call it plan-based programming. So you have a plan, and it's the way we should do things. We have this program, it's called the Planning, Programming, Budgeting, Execution System, where we plan first, then we program to the plan, then we budget, then we execute. But in the world of actual planning, that theory wasn't applied. What happened is somebody would say, I need a new building. Here's my programming document called the 1391. Planners, go find me a site for this. And the result was vacant lot planning. Find a vacant lot, that's where it goes. Very disconnected. Here at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, the planners are actually developing an idea of how they want to transform a street, and then they create a program of projects. In this case, it's all SRM or operations and maintenance funding to fix that. This is change in the world of programming, but our programmers can be our greatest partners in helping us execute the plan that's been developed collaboratively. So those are the 10 strategies, and they're supported by the tactics that I talked about. But in addition, we talk about consistency across the process and products, so at least we have a floor. We opened up this process in Eugene, Oregon, brought all the senior planners for the agencies to Eugene, and we asked them, hey, what are your concerns out there? And how can we address those? What are some best practices out there? And what are your unique cultural aspects that we don't want to tread on? Because the Air Force is different than the Army, is different than the Marine Corps, is different than the Navy. I think Jerry can support this. What was really interesting is there weren't really any. Folks said, we're all in this together. So when we figured that out, we said, okay, then what is the common baseline, the foundation of planning that we can use? And then go from there and add anything you need. And it turns out that there was some consistency. And the first and most important element was creating a vision. You know the saying, where there is no vision, the people shall perish. Pretty good document. The idea of having a vision, because without that, we're not going to get anywhere. So a vision plan that identifies our developable area, creates a framework for development, looks to our key constraints and opportunities, starts the process off. And where we prototype this has been tremendous, because it not only gets the vision to the table, it gets the leadership to the table. And they become the biggest stakeholders and advocates for the planning process when they're involved in creating the vision for their installation. Following that is the preparation of planning standards. What are the standards for your streets, for your buildings, and for your landscapes that you need to use? Agencies call these different things, and one thing that we didn't do is we didn't come up with a consistent kind of lexicon of what we call these. The Army calls this the Installation Design Guide, the Air Force calls it a Facility Excellence Plan, the Navy calls it an Installation Appearance Plan, the Marine Corps had a BEAP. It's like, well, whatever you call it, it's still a planning standard. And that standard becomes our pattern book. Chris Alexander's book of pattern language is a good example, where you can come up with empirically based and tested standards for development. You can think of these as guidelines, but you create that planning language. And then you use that language to create the installation development plan. This is a term we borrowed from the Air Force. The IDP consists of two things, those area development plans and the network plans that connect them together. And that's really the heart of the plan. And that supports the vision, and it's developed through applying those standards. And then we actually create the program. You have a plan, and now what are the projects we need at all scales to get us to the achievement of that plan? And then you wrap it up. You publish a summary document. The Air Force wants these things online. The Army does publish documents. However it's done, but we summarize it for our leadership to say we actually have a plan that can guide our growth short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And it was amazing how quick we came up with consistency and agreement that this should be the minimum floor criteria. And the UFC sets the floor, and then agencies can adjust as needed. So you can see there's an alignment between the process and the products that come out of the process. And then there's education training, because it's one thing to write a document, it's another thing to actually get people to use it. So as part of this process, Jerry has set up the Department of Defense's Master Planning Institute, and the Master Planning Institute supports a series of courses that are AIA and AICP certified. These are professional certifications, as many of you know. But the idea is that we have now an educational program supporting this. So if you want to learn about form-based planning, or if you want to learn about sustainable planning, we have courses that are offered around the country that you can do this in. So the Master Planning Institute is a program that allows education to occur, so folks just aren't hanging out there on their own. And what we've found is people are very interested both in foundational education. What is planning about? Because oftentimes we'll get planners at our installations that don't come from a great university like this, but come from a background of, hey, you know, I was just hired, I was doing real property, and now I'm a planner. What do I do? Well, here's the foundation of planning. We talk about the practices and the theories, and then we have advanced courses in advanced master planning and form-based planning, master planning, energy and sustainability, and then we have practicums, which are actually on-site training programs where they learn by doing. So we're doing practicums right now at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, at Buckley Air Force Base, and across the DoD, so folks actually get involved in creating a plan. So the idea of education and training, even this era of limited budgets, is very important to make sure that people understand the process and how to apply that process. So where have we applied this? And this is the last part of my presentation before we take a break. Well, we've applied it across the DoD. I'm going to give you an example from each of the agencies. So fortunately, we were guided and smart enough, I think, thanks to Jerry, that we're not going to do this inside the Beltway. We're going to actually figure out a way to see if this works. So we prototyped these ideas over the last 2 years at installations, and we've adjusted and modeled. In fact, the UFC, we had over 700 comments. We did multiple webinars. We've had all kinds of integration to make sure that this was developed collaboratively, and the application was important. Now, I've given you some examples from Joint Base Lewis McChord, but this is about 2.5 years ago, when we were doing the Joint Base Lewis McChord process, we actually got some pushback from folks across the Army. Oh, yeah, that's out on the left coast. Sure, they can do sustainability, but we're not going to do it elsewhere. So guess what? Army's biggest installation at Fort Hood, Texas, Those folks are very interested. So if you can do it at Fort Hood, you can do it anywhere. And this is an example at the Clear Creek Darnell Area Development Plan that they're working on as a way to create a more compact, walkable area at Fort Hood. And the most important element is the stakeholder engagement that they've had at Fort Hood. There's the Garrison Commander, Colonel Mark Freitag. They're participating in creating the vision for Fort Hood. We had over 140 people at the visioning session, from on-installation folks to off-installation folks. So we had the planners, city council members from adjoining communities participating with us in helping create the vision for development at Fort Hood. And that stakeholder engagement is a key direction in the UFC. But also is learning from other areas. You know, actually, outside of Killeen, there's some great examples. Georgetown is a historic town, just a little bit away from the installation. So we actually take folks out in these processes to learn about the local installations and learn about patterns that are appropriate and inappropriate for development at installations. We create illustrative plans. So in this case, they develop, amazingly, all the kind of yellow in the middle. This is potential new housing. We have an issue of housing on our installations where the general idea is we send our housing off to the local economy. Roughly 70% or so of military families are housed on the local economy, 20 to 30% on the installation, which really surprises me because we're actually forcing the problem. Now, all these families have to drive back onto the installation, causing a lot of congestion and air quality problems. If we have the land, why can't we figure out a way to use other people's money, our privatized housing partners, and have them build more land on the installations? Well, at Fort Hood, they wanted to figure out a way to do this, and they actually found a lot of land to do this, and now the housing partner is very excited about building more housing on the installation. At Fort Polk in Louisiana and at Fort Sill, these are other installations that have very low housing numbers. At Fort Sill, only 17% of military families can live on the installation. The housing partner wanted to build more housing, but they didn't have more land. So we're working through a process that identifies appropriate use and appropriate land. In this case, folks can walk from the housing area to a new shopping area, a little Main Street development over here with a neighborhood park, or to a major new hospital that's currently under construction. So the idea of creating the plan and then creating the regulating plan or the enhanced land use plan that gives the developers now more flexibility, but flexibility consistent with the overall vision that the installation themselves have established, which is very important. And then the idea of that little town square, built largely with other people's money, whether it's housing money or the exchange, but the partners come into the process. So Fort Hood, now that it's been done in prototype there, has been a good example for the Army. For the Marine Corps Air Station Miramar in San Diego has been doing a lot of great work thinking about how to transition from an old Navy installation to a sustainable Marine Corps installation with a whole host of weapon systems on its flight line, fixed wing and rotary wing. The idea there is we started with the framework plan, and the participants in the workshops worked on the vision, identified the districts, created the districts on the installation, and then prioritized the districts. The darker the color means the more important. So they just finished up the flight line area development plan. There's one at Rose Canyon North and the industrial. They'll be doing a main side practicum. If any of you are interested, you certainly can come to these practicums. We can give you more information. You get professional credit, and there is no tuition cost. But the idea is people are learning about the process, creating the framework plan that can guide growth. In this case, over at Rose Canyon North, they identified, as you can see, developable area, significant area for development. 182 acres. You can see buildable area needs a little bit more work, but in an area that they thought was built out, there's actually room for growth. And then they created a plan, and the planners got all excited about, well, what if we had new mission that required new housing? Could we build some here? And you can see new housing in a townhome prototype around a central park, and a little 9-hole golf course is a possibility. And here this idea of capacity comes into play. They'd actually been thinking about building housing, and there's a plan for housing off the installation on the east side, but now they might need to look at a different pattern because there's some environmental issues with the landscape over there. But Miramar has been doing a great job, also a great job with energy and thinking about energy and sustainability together. In the Air Force, Buckley Air Force Base has been a great model. They pretty much built a new base from scratch outside of Denver, Colorado in support of their development. Here we had over 100 people participate in the visioning session there, including folks from the community, which has been really amazing there. Over the visioning session and 2 area development plan practicums, we had the city planners from Aurora spend 2.5 weeks with us, participating in the planning process. A very difficult thing to do is actually craft a clear vision statement. This has nothing to do about today's mission. It's a vision statement that we can actually see that has measurable goals embedded in it. So the idea of transit, the idea of mixed uses and connected pedestrian-friendly streets, those become our guidance and our direction. And what's innovative about Buckley, what they're doing is focusing on what can we do now to achieve that vision with just short-term operations and maintenance funding. So projects that are identified in this plan are simply SRM projects, sustainment, restoration, modernization projects, so you don't need big-ticket items. But on the other hand, we do know they have some big-ticket items. In this case, inside kind of a research zone, they have areas, and then we were putting on the walking circles. So we add the known program. And then we show room for potential growth. This is kind of long-term capacity, and that really focuses in on new campus-like development on the top side, and towards the bottom, new housing and a new Main Street development pattern at the bottom. So this is just in case something is called for, they have room for growth, and that is planning. Planning is not just citing our known projects. Planning is thinking long-term into the future. And lastly, I think one of the most innovative at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. They've been doing a lot of great work there, thinking about how to take that landscape, which has a lot of issues in terms of history and culture and environmental, and how do you accommodate the growth at a joint base. And just a couple of examples. This is an image done by one of the planners there, Joaquin Pedron. Joaquin is probably one of our best planners in the DoD right now. And he's been working on a way to connect Hickam, the old Air Force base, and Pearl, the old Navy base. How do you bring those two together? Easier said than done because it's two very different cultures. Well, separating the two installations right now is this kind of street, South Avenue and Porter. Now, there was a fence there, there's a kind of a pipeline there. And how do you change that pattern? How do you take something that's been a divider and make it a connector? So he's been using the UFC and through a series of practicums starting to make changes, and they already got the fence down. The plans aren't even dry. The fence is down. He's now working on SRM projects to do upgrades to various roads around the installations. And we do know trees grow there, so the idea is you take it from a divider to a connector. And now it becomes something that truly makes it a joint base from a planning point of view. Certainly there are many other more important issues on jointness, but the idea of planning becoming part of that is important. And this idea of visualizing these is a key. You also put this together thinking about how that could work at the ground level. So here we're kind of looking at the street from the ground, starting to make that transformation. And a lot of this can be done without big-ticket military construction. It's just fixing your sidewalks, getting the power underground, doing some appropriate landscaping. And the trees aren't there for looks. The trees are there for low-impact development strategies and pedestrian safety. So the idea across the DoD is we've been prototyping the strategies, we've been prototyping the process, and we're seeing great support at our installations, large and small, regardless of the service, to implement these. Well, I want to wrap up with just this idea of how is this all connected together. When we think of planning across the DoD, it's an enterprise, and we have to think of the enterprise approach. There are many people that are engaged. The services, whether Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, our installations, our major commands, our design and construction agents, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or Naval Facility Engineering Command, in some ways the Air Force Center for Engineering and the Environment. They all have their ideas and their own concepts. Many of the ideas that they talk about are things that we've discussed: sustainability, low-impact development, energy efficiency. Resiliency is a big topic too. All these are ideas that are filtering, and we have these filters that impact what actually gets to us as planners. Certainly it's filtered by leadership. We have changing leadership. Oftentimes leaders change plans. What are we going to do there? We have different levels of competency, and this is where the Defense Master Planning Institute comes into play. Let's raise the level of competency through appropriate education and training. We certainly have standards, and we need to change the standards. The UFC is part of that. I think the most difficult filter is that one on culture. This is a significant cultural shift from the way we've done things. And certainly we have to address that through education and training. We have to address that through standards. We have to educate our leadership on this. But it's getting the culture to change, which is the most challenging piece. Because in the end, when we think about master planning, that's what master planning is about, is actually creating that cultural shift. So with that, that is the idea of planning. That's inside the UFC. It really supports the goals of our executive orders that have been addressed. It supports the goals of our families and communities who want to have more installations that are better and more livable. But we have to do it in a way that's consistent across the department, and the UFC helps us do that. So with that, we are going to take a short break, about a 10-minute break. We're right on time, so it's 10:30, so we're going to start back at about 10:40-ish. So we'll take a 10-minute break, then we'll have the panel up here, and we'll be addressing questions and comments. So thank you very much, and we'll start back in 10.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. This is the best part. You came back. I'm Dave Robertson. I'm the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and I'll be the moderator for the second half of the program. A little bit about COG. We're very similar to NCPC. We are regional. They're regional. I have responsibilities that are sort of authority and a lot that's advisory. But the nice thing, and as I was listening to the earlier presentations, the principles around sustainability we heard about today that are really so exciting in this UFC are really hardwired into the work of NCPC, their customers principally the federal government, my customers principally local governments. And if we can get, and I think there's some real opportunity here in the National Capital Region to get an alignment between the principles by our federal family, which is a very important part of our family, the local and state officials and the local governments in this region, and then our partners in the private sector, other people's money, because apparently the federal government's money is in short supply these days. And so if we can sort of align that, I think we've got some real opportunities. You heard some amazing presentations the first part of this morning. I'm going to give a brief introduction of our third panelist, or our third participant here today. You do have all of the bios, of course, of these fine folks in your packet today. But I wanted to introduce Jim Manzelman, who is the Deputy Director for Mission Services, Defense Intelligence Agency. In that capacity, he's had some significant responsibilities, again, for government, military contract personnel, and working within the Defense Intelligence senior levels facilities for mission services. Again, very much in alignment with what we've heard. Also, a military background, a Naval Reserve officer, licensed architect. There seems to be a nice convergence of these skills. And one of the things I've always learned a lot from military facility managers is the job is very much like a city or county manager in many ways, in that you have to pull together a lot of resources across disciplines to make sure that everybody's pulling in the right direction. And this UFC that has been laid out, I think, is going to be really a blueprint for some real success, not only in the National Capital Region, which is where NCPC and COG are focused on our work, but not only that, but nationally and globally as well. So my role here this morning is to toss out a few questions for our panelists, get some discussion going. We do have question cards, so staff have them, so if you've got a question or two, write it down. Staff will roam the audience and pick that up and hand it to me, because we want to make sure we get plenty of time to answer your questions. Let me just start off with a couple of general questions. One thing, we were talking during the break, one thing that didn't get discussed a lot that I know NCPC and COG have been focused on a lot is the issue of security. I was here 9/11. It had a profound impact on the built environment, not just with federal facilities, but other public facilities around the region. Talk a little bit about how security considerations might be integrated with the UFC and some of that work, and maybe toss it to you for maybe a quick response.
Thanks. First of all, I'm the lightweight on the stage here. I'm here primarily because I'm working very closely with a project with NCPC in Montgomery County, and also the neighborhood very closely in a project up at Bethesda. And this is an old site that we're recapitalizing basically for the intelligence community as an intelligence community campus. But I will say, and going to Mark's comments, there are a lot of threads that I pulled out of your work that have applied to what we're doing on the campus. But security, clearly, post 9/11, immediately everybody is standoff distance, the force protection barriers, K-rail, whoever makes K-rails became very rich. The thing I would say is that for designers and planners in the room, going back to trying to achieve a greater density and the ability to walk and pedestrians, the question of security always comes up. Well, we need standoff distances, which then increases the spread or the sprawl. And we've done some things working, and I've really pressed the last 3, 4, 5 years on even using natural elements as barriers. You know, a tree grove or a rock wall or a rock wall with an earth berm behind it are just as effective as those K-rails. We've also taken on some of our buildings where, you know, you have a difference or an opportunity on the standoff to also increase the ability of the skin to resist explosives. And that's getting better and better cost-wise. Our own building in Bowling, instead of 1/4-inch glass airspace, 1/4-inch glass, we have 1/4-inch glass airspace and 3/4-inch glass. So we're able to bring things back in close to the building, easier for pedestrians to walk to it. On the Bethesda campus, I would just say a couple things. You mentioned a shared vision, and I think that's what we've been very successful on at Bethesda, is bringing not only the NCPC, but the neighbors together, the county together to walk the site. It was an existing site from 1946 that with post 9/11 increased in density, so we're part of Dr. Levine's 1.5 billion square yards of parking. They have a Walmart parking lot of 2,000 cars that takes up about 60% of a 30-acre site. So collecting that back into a multi-story garage, returning that front yard to landscaped area, preserving buffers around the site were very, very important to us. Metro, you mentioned, you know, mass transit. When we're done, we have a shuttle that goes to the nearest metro station, and as an agency, when we're complete with our facility master plan here, all 4 of our prime sites will be connected by metro. So people going to meetings, people just going to work will be able to use the metro system with a shuttle to the nearest metro station, which I think will serve us well. The last thing I'll mention too is the daylighting. I will tell you in intelligence, going back in history, we used to like to work in caves because there was computer emissions and you couldn't possibly allow those to get outside the building. So no windows, thickened walls, and I will tell you with our building Bowling, what we're going to be doing at the Bethesda campus by adding natural light glass into the room, because computers nowadays have the shielding needed to protect. We actually, Bowling, cut our energy use per square foot significantly by adding a building 1/3 the size of the old one, but had double the glass and reduced the overall energy footprint of the campus down there. So the daylighting is extremely important as well. I think I'll leave it there, but again, I go back to that force protection security issue. There are other design solutions that can be applied that fit with the direction that Mark wants to go, and I think looking at those design solutions will help us overall, not only in saving money, but making our buildings more pedestrian access free, and I think that goes a long way.
Dr. Gillum or Dr. Robine, any comment on the security piece?
Well, I could do a graduate seminar on security. We'll try and avoid that. I think there are 3 key issues, and the first is getting our security partners to the table early in the planning process. There's been great success at that. Actually, this week out at the Natick Soldier System Center outside of Boston, they're doing a planning practicum for new facilities in line with the master planning vision. The physical security and the force protection experts have been there all week and are a key player in the process because they have a role to play, certainly. So that's one piece. The second point is that we have a set of rules. There is a UFC regarding anti-terrorism force protection. It was modified in February, and those modifications are a significant improvement, but a little confusing. So you'll find in the new master plan in UFC, our security partners have actually created a new table of standoff distances for master planning that are actually quite reasonable. And if we use an appropriate building type, which is a more sustainable building type, we can get down to an 11-meter standoff for primary occupied facilities, which is roughly 33 feet. So that's not bad at all. So there are rules that we need to follow. The third point is that unfortunately there are folks out there who are making up their own rules. And we're seeing things that don't really need to be done. The UFC doesn't tell us that we need to put bollards around every little building. The UFC doesn't tell us that we need to take windows out of buildings. What's happening is we need to exercise, I think we collectively as a group need to exercise a little more control over the rules that are applied and the rules that are invented. Because obviously we know that if an action occurs on somebody's watch, and this happened to General Terry Schwallier after the Khobar Towers incident, he lost his job. And people don't want to lose their job, so they're thinking about every kind of crazy idea in the world to make installations more secure. But we have a unified set of criteria for security. That's what should be applied, and it should be applied through a collaborative stakeholder process, and I think we'll get into a much better direction.
We have the Department of Defense has a different set of standards for ATFP, anti-terrorism force protection, than the rest of the federal government. The rest of the federal government uses a set of standards or an approach developed by an interagency group led by the Department of Homeland Security called ISC, for Interagency Security Committee, ISC standards, for leased. It focuses on leased space. We have been looking at whether we could adopt, we DoD should adopt what the rest of the federal government uses rather than our own approach, which is much less flexible. Our own approach says you have to put in place a certain set of ATFP measures regardless of where the building is located, how many people are in it, what the mission is. The ISC standards take into account size of building, number of employees, mission criticality, symbolic value, a number of other things. So it is risk-based. It is a risk-based process, which seems sensible. So we have been looking at whether we can adopt the ISC standards for leased space. And is Mike McAnder here? Mike, oh yeah, there you are. We've not yet. Okay. Okay. So, but I think we are leaning in that direction. It is ultimately not up to me, it's up to the threat protection people in the Department of Defense. We will work closely with GSA to do a cost-benefit comparison of our approach versus the ISC approach. Once we finish that, we'll then look at the ATFP standards that when we apply for buildings on a base. We now do not distinguish between a building in the middle of campus and a building in downtown Washington, D.C. We apply the same ATFP standards with our... You hold the mic closer. Yeah, we ignore the fact that there is or should be a secure perimeter at a military base. So I think, to me, that's an easier call, that we ought not be applying the same standard to a building in the middle of a base. We may need to shore up the secure perimeter, but we ought to, if you've got a secure perimeter, you ought not be having to go through the same ATFP process that you do in the downtown city.
Great, thank you. We've had a very nice response from the audience in terms of questions, so we're going to dig into these questions right off the bat, and any of the panelists can respond. This is one that I think was touched on throughout the presentations a little bit. Are there any examples of successfully being able to maintain a commitment to a plan throughout changes in leadership? Base changes a good bit from time to time. There's political changes. Talk about the sort of staying power of these policies and how they might be applied throughout changes in leadership.
Well, actually, they're great examples. Joint Base Lewis McChord is the most recent and probably best example. The original master plan done under the direction of Colonel Cindy Murphy, the garrison commander, they're very engaged and motivated about creating a great plan. The new commander, Colonel Tommy Britton, has been there a couple of years, and he took that plan and is now marching forward with that. Now, we hear a lot of feedback from installation planners complaining about the fact that their plans are always changing, a new commander throws things out the window. And Jerry and I have actually taught at a garrison pre-command course for a number of years, and I encourage the commanders to do that. Hey, take a look at your plan, and if your plan is no good, toss it out the window. And I would say 9 out of 10 plans weren't very good. They weren't giving the clear direction that the commanders needed, so they get tossed out the window. But what we found is where there's a clear plan with clear direction, and the new leaders are briefed by the old leaders, then they start to understand that their job is to start executing, because we don't want to see this cycle of continually making new plans. So if you have a clear, effective plan, and that's exactly how Fort Sill, historic Fort Sill was done, historic Fort Riley, historic Fort Leavenworth, they're not tossing that plan out the window, because it was a great plan over 80 years ago. And that's really been the key, is informing leadership that there's a plan there and what their role is in terms of execution of the plan. So I would say that's been important.
This one, I think, touches on something that's always in the news, personnel reductions and funding cuts. How are master planning and workplace reduction strategies informing one another? Efficient workplace footprint and operations can support density, sustainability while improving quality and productivity. I know that just here in the Washington area, GSA is looking to, reorient some of its footprint of its building and actually use less space per worker. How does that relate to some of the work that's going on through the UFC or other best practices in the Washington area?
Testing? Yeah. Couple things on, well, there's several messages in there. One is the downsizing of bases or reductions in force. I think, in my mind, reductions in force, and Mike's sitting there in front too, is work brack. So my sense is reductions in force may bring us to the next brack and the ability to consolidate further at our facilities. I think and clearly reductions of funding is going to drive us, and I would tell you with our own organization, and Dr. Ravine mentioned that with overhead costs, just our ability to reduce our overhead costs preserves that many more dollars for mission. So our reducing our holdings there. I know I will tell you for our own organization within the National Capital Region, I'm in the process, with the help of the department, going from over 20 buildings in the National Capital Region down to 4, which greatly increases the density in a single building and reduces the number of front doors that I have to secure across the vicinity. So those would be a couple examples for me.
We are looking to do another BRAC. We've asked Congress for the authority to do 2 more BRAC rounds. We are reducing force structure. We're cutting our budget substantially, $250 billion over the next five years, and so substantial force reductions, and you can't cut force structure without reducing infrastructure. So we've asked Congress for authority to do BRAC rounds in 2013 and 2015. I would say that they have not been wildly enthusiastic about the request. I have been a piñata for several months up on Capitol Hill. So I think we do need a BRAC. I'm not sure if the question may have been, are there going to be enough people to do planning as you make cuts in administrative staff? And I think that is an issue. We're certainly seeing that issue with our energy managers. We're concerned that just when we're making a big push to do improvements in energy efficiency, that the services are going to be cutting energy managers on basis. So that's a problem. I will, just to go back to BRAC for a minute, I really wish that we had gone through this process before the 2005 BRAC round. I think we could have done a much better job had we had this sort of a plan in place. And you might talk about your encounter at Fort Sill. Do you remember that? Yeah.
Well, actually, I could probably talk a lot of stories. I'm not sure if you want to hear a lot of stories. But certainly we've been to installations like Fort Sill, where when we started the process down there, I'd asked them, where is your master plan that's guiding all this BRAC-directed funding? And they're getting a lot of funding. It's a great place for that. And the planners, kind of shook their head and, kind of said, well, follow me. And I'm thinking, where are we going here? And they take me into this kind of little storage room. And inside this storage room are these, you remember the old steel case metal filing cabinets? Look like they belong on a Navy ship or something. So they pull this thing out like it had never been opened in a decade. And they pull this out and dust is on this thing. And then they lift out some documents, kind of crumbling documents. Well, here's our plan. Like, what? You've got to be kidding me. They hadn't updated their plan because BRAC was moving so fast, they didn't have time. They did a great job with the resources that they had, and Dorothy's absolutely right. If they had a more effective plan, and they know that, if they had a plan that had been done prior to BRAC, then that would have positioned them in a much better way to accommodate the growth that had occurred. As it was, they were left kind of scrambling in the vacant lot planning mode because they didn't have a plan. I think also another issue is at the very small scale, as we see fewer people in all these buildings, it's just like in this room. We grow to fill the available space. In your house, you probably do the same thing. You just fill whatever rooms are there. We found this at military installations too. Headquarters Installation Management Command has been doing a great job of supporting training, planning practicums out in the field. So they were recently over in Italy, in Vicenza, and looking at a way to start to reduce the footprint. And the first step, and this was Headquarters Corps of Engineers really organized the effort, and the first step was to just walk through all the buildings and see how effectively are they being utilized. People have been downsized, what's happening? And we found out that there was a lot of extra square footage in buildings that didn't necessarily need to be taken up by the folks that were in there. So that allowed the team to start to think about repurposing those buildings more effectively using O&M funds. So instead of planning a new military construction project, start to plan a way to more effectively bring people together in appropriately sized settings. Certainly that we'd still want to work in those areas. We're not trying to cram people in by any means, but making sure we use our space appropriately and use the facilities that we have appropriately before we go asking for more. And that means we have to study how buildings and places are being used currently.
Next question, the new UFC clearly offers great new innovative sustainable design on-site. What current thinking for transportation connectivity outside the gates to surrounding communities? Certainly that's something important here in the National Capital Region where, unlike places in Texas and elsewhere where they're in more rural areas, they're in either urban or suburban communities. So anybody want to talk about connectivity to the community?
Well, I could, Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, I've been working the Honolulu Light Rail, as I'd mentioned, is going to be going right by the gate to the Pearl side. So we've been looking at ways that we can coordinate the land use patterns at the installation with what the Honolulu Light Rail system's doing so that we can coordinate a future shuttle on the base to connect to the light rail to then get people around the installation. And then significantly, we're looking at kind of getting rid of the land uses, but creating a morphology that supports transit-oriented development. Because it's one thing to have a shuttle bus to get somewhere, but if you have to walk 20 minutes from the bus stop in an area that has no sidewalks, you're not going to take that shuttle. So the idea is coordinating land use and transportation off the installation and on the installation. Again, at Fort Sill, they actually have the city bus comes onto the installation. I'm not sure how the local security guys got that figured out, but they did, and that's pretty effective. So thinking about that land use transportation coordination is going to be an important piece both on and off the installation.
I have a feeling the questioner is from Northern Virginia.
That could be a good guess.
I think we didn't do a great job there in the 2005 background. I think there was not a traffic congestion. Well, it is part of the consideration internally when we're figuring out where to consolidate. So which bases are going to expand? Because BRAC, people think BRAC is you're closing bases, but you're moving stuff to others. So there is expansion at other places. The Northern Virginia received a lot of people, a lot of personnel. The Mark Center, long story, but it aggravated the congestion problem. I don't think there was a sufficient appreciation that transportation congestion is not a linear process, that it's exponential, and you add a little bit, and that has a significant impact on a system that is already operating at or near capacity. So I think we have kept it under, I will say, in our defense through very, very aggressive efforts and good cooperation and good efforts on the part of Virginia. I think we haven't seen the kind of problems at the Mark Center that I thought we would, frankly. Now, we don't have everybody in place yet, but I think we will do a much better job of that when we do another BRAC, if we have similar situations.
Several of the questions really speak to implementation, and maybe we could learn a little more about, because I understand that the UFC was released today or thereabouts. Is that correct, or will be? 50. Okay. What other sort of regulatory implementation steps have to be put in place so that this really has teeth and then begins to move forward? And this question touches on one of those. What budget fiscal regulations need to be revised in order to allow project funds from different sources to be combined into a single project? You talked about other people's money. How do we make it easy for other people's money to get to the table through some of these procedures?
Well, I can start. I might ask Mike to clarify if I make any mistakes here, but that can be done right now. We can mix money. It's called conjunctive funding. You put appropriated money in part of a building, non-appropriated in another part of a building, you make it clear on the programming document, which is called the 1391, and it's certainly legitimate. The issue is it easy? And I think the part of the problem is people don't understand how easy it can be to do that because it really hasn't been done. So I think rather than any kind of policy or rule change, it just needs a bit of education out in the field that this is certainly doable. The hard part is coordinating the various proponents of the building elements. So if you want to do housing on top of retail, for example, you've got to get the retail people and the housing people to synchronize their programming, their design, their construction. And in a world where everybody likes to do their own thing, that's the hardest part. And that gets back to that cultural problem I talked about. And how do we address that culture in a way that's consistent with where we want to go? So I think it's certainly doable, and we don't even need to think about mixing money in some cases. We can put an education center on the ground floor and appropriately funded barracks on the top, and that's something we could do if we just coordinate appropriated funds. So there are opportunities out there without any policy. Is that kind of right, Mike?
You're right on. Are there comments on that?
I think the two-part answer. I mean, I'm new to DOD. I've been there 3 years, but I had not previously worked in the building. I had worked with DOD, but never in the building. And as I've said, my background is in public policy, and I'm very market-oriented. And so I came in looking for ways to use the market to further our goals. And we had a great success story with housing privatization. I can talk about that. And but the DOD is a command and control organization. It is a different organization. It responds to, people respond to guidance and directive and planning documents. I mean, we do plans. We're control freaks. We like to control everything. And so documents like this have more of an impact than one might think. It is, people are hungry for direction. Now, that's not to say this will, everybody will turn on a dime. Mark was giving me an example last night of a base, which will go unnamed, where there's a plan to put housing off in a distant location when there is an underutilized golf course, as he put it, on the base. Now, I don't, probably the desire to keep the underutilized golf course there is probably not going to go away. We probably would have to struggle to get that housing built where the golf course now is. But there is an openness to this that I think may surprise people who have not worked in the DoD environment.
Well, that's actually a really good segue to the next question. And it just touches on a lot of those themes. Does the UFC require change, or is it a guideline for change? I mean, how effective?
Yeah, no, I think it's guidance. Mike, do you want to say any more? This is Mike McAndrew, who's the head of my facilities management office and oversees the entire UFC process.
Yeah, actually, I'm super soft. I'll try to use my big boy voice. I got a big boy voice.
Recording.
Oh, I'm sorry. so used to use my big boy voice. Yeah, what the UFC is a guidance. However, what we're trying to do is make it a little more applicable to the bases and put a little more teeth into it. As Dorothy mentioned, they're hungry for guidance, but if it goes unused or it goes without teeth, they tend not to use it and they go back on the shelf like they've done over the past 30, 40 years, as Mark has been alluding to. So we're going to be issue policy that's going to require a little more oversight from my organization, the headquarters, from all the services. And since I oversee the defense agencies, I'll have to put something in place for them. Those who control installations, very few of them do. But it's a teeth and oversight issue that I have to work through now with the user to make it a useful guidance.
The one thing I would offer is, and I agree with Mike, because I've been both private sector, I've been military, and I've seen those publications that go on the shelf and stay there forever. I think the thing that's going to bring success to this is the examples of success, communicating that success, the presentations, the training, but if we start showing some real results out there, and that's what I'm hopeful for Bethesda, we show some examples of what can be done. Other installation commanders or other designers of installations will see those examples, learn by them, and then are able to apply that practice, and I think it's going to grow and spread in that way.
The next question is something near and dear to the heart of everybody in the Washington area, transportation. We touched on that a little bit. Please go into more detail on transportation. I think then transportation policy within DOD needs a lot more attention. Shuttles, public transit access, et cetera, bike ped facilities, infrastructure. How do we make DOD non-single occupancy vehicle dependent? Anybody want to jump into that one? It's a hard one.
Is that referring to the Pentagon or other?
Well, I'm sure it could be that, but maybe other facilities as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're talking about the Pentagon, actually, I think most people take the metro. It's pretty well located. It's impossible to get a cab, but it's good for the metro. I think for other bases, that's what this is all about. This is getting away from cars, making it easier to walk, to bike share, possibly transit.
You know, one thing that we've tried to avoid, in fact, it's not really in the document, is the issue of density. If I tell you in Oregon 2 words that people hate, density and sprawl. Now, how can you have that? Because if you want to avoid sprawl, you need to get a little more dense there. So the idea is we're afraid of that word density because we immediately start to think of Pruitt-Igoe and failed public housing and 40-story buildings. But that's not what we're talking about at all. So what we've done is abandon the language of dwelling units per acre, for example, as a housing measure, and we're talking about typologies. Dorothy lives on Capitol Hill in a beautiful area of townhomes, and that's a typology that you can build at 20 to 30 dwelling units per acre. We also have single-family bungalow homes built on the West Coast that can be done at 8 to 10 units per acre. So the idea, and you can also build single-family housing at 3 to 4 units per acre that is absolutely terrible. So the idea is really not density, the idea is typology. So what we do know empirically is that if we have neighborhoods where we're at 20 to 30 units per acre, which is a townhome, a row house type model, and we have 6 transit trips per hour, that's every 10 minutes, we know empirically that Americans are going to drive 50% less. So we apply that empirical evidence, and then we can forecast installations where that's going to happen. So that what we've been able to do is start to say, okay, let's bring in on-installation housing or on-installation unaccompanied housing, and let's tie that in a way that can support transit. Let's get the density up, using that word. Let's get it up in a way that can support transit. Maybe a little shuttle right now, maybe a bus in the future, maybe long-term some kind of streetcar, but the idea is the land use and transportation has to be connected together. And we've had great success in doing this, thinking about those 2 pieces together, land use and transportation. Because without that, we're not really going to get transit to work. And installations have tried this and transit has failed because nobody wants to walk 20 minutes across a vacant landscape to get from building to building. So it all works together in a much more cohesive way, and we certainly can learn from Capitol Hill as a great model.
One of the things mentioned at the end of this document is it's encouragement to put more families, have more families live on the base. And I was frankly surprised that survived, because our policy has been to have most military families live on the economy, as we put it. In other words, live in town. We have some housing. We have privatized housing for families on base, but most people at an installation live in the adjacent town. And I think Mark's was pushing having more people live on base for two reasons. One, it reduces traffic, the kind of traffic that creates congestion in Northern Virginia. But it also creates more cohesion, the more people you have living on the base. The reason that's controversial is that it's expensive. We can't afford to put more housing on base. So some part of my staff pushed back on that. And but I think that is, I don't know how that will come out. But I think that is another way in which potentially we can reduce our traffic impact.
Well, I think this is something we've had a good debate on over this piece. And I'll never forget going in, we were at the headquarters Corps of Engineer office, and we were working on a set of draft policy letters. And one of them was on housing. And we kind of put in, well, we'd like to flip the equation, 70% on installation, 30% off. And I got word that Dr. Robine wanted to meet and talk about this, and I thought for sure she was going to kind of throw something at me. But no, the idea is maybe 70% is not the right number, but the idea of thinking differently about housing. And I think this is where the market model can work very effectively, is it doesn't have to be taxpayer money. You know, we use our housing allowance to bring our private partners on board to create housing. Now, it has to be in a great neighborhood, because we can't force military families to live in military family housing on installations. So you make a great neighborhood for that to work. So we get other people's money to play here, and it's really the role of planning to find room for that to happen. You're well familiar with the jobs housing balance. A military installation is tremendous jobs, but not much housing. So there's an imbalance there. So what we're trying to do is rebalance that equation in a way that's more effective. And we certainly know that not every military family wants to live on a base. In fact, when I was on active duty, there was no way I wanted to live on a base. The library was shut down, the club was shut down. It was just a dead zone. It was like an office park. Why would I want to live there? But the idea is, if we can create a military installation like some of our old historic posts that actually is a lively, community-based place, then people want to live there. What's really interesting, and we haven't talked much about this at all, there's an idea of neighborhood cohesion, which is the ability of neighbors to know one another and support one another in times of stress. The University of Chicago has done great research on this. What we've been trying to do is figure out, how does the built environment support or inhibit neighborhood cohesion? We don't want to get into the discussion of environments determining behavior, but certainly we can talk about how environments can facilitate behavior. And in some Navy-funded research, we did a scientific survey of military families living in an overseas location, and we actually made a connection between building typology and neighborhood morphology and this idea of neighborhood cohesion. Kind of long-winded, but the idea is families that lived in townhomes or single-family homes had a much higher rate of neighborhood cohesion. They knew their neighbors, they supported one another, than families living in apartments. Also, families start to think about resiliency and neighborhood cohesion, and the idea of getting to know your neighbors and supporting one another in times of stress is certainly an important piece that planners need to be aware of.
One other thing, you will see in this plan a requirement for if we build either privatized housing or regular government-owned housing on a base, it has to have a front porch or a porch. And I really fought to have that on there. I bought my house on Capitol Hill because of the front porch. It is and other homes on my block have a front porch, and it changes the nature of the block, those front porches. And I think that's a very, very desirable feature. So it seems incredibly prescriptive on the one hand for us to say you have to have a porch, it has to be 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide, but I think I think in the context it's useful.
Did you want to jump in?
Just real quick, I already talked about shuttles, and I would only say that the last link between that metro station, if we can do with a shuttle, because most of our facilities are within a mile or 2 or 3, so that helps. And I think and of course we look forward to our light rail that's supposed to come to Joint Base Anacostia Bowling sometime soon, so you've already experienced that. We're supposed to have one in the near future. But I think the last step for us is going to be and what the department's encouraging, the telework. And even with our very classified facilities, our analysts work primarily on computers, so they can network from a variety of sites, and the ability to now have 4 sites in the National Capital Region spread where people can commute a shorter distance to work and still do their work, or even bicycle to work by providing the lockers and shower facilities that they can change, I think are going to help us a great deal.
Two of the questions are very similar, so let me just sort of see if I can blend them. Discuss how the new UFC will respond to major mission changes, and they cite Fort Bliss, missiles to tanks. Another variation on this, how well does this accommodate requirements for evolving existing missions? Things are changing world. Federal government and DOD sometimes have to turn on a dime to respond to new threats or opportunities. So how does this potentially accommodate changes of fundamental mission?
Mark, you want to talk about Lewis McChord? That's a good...
Sure, yeah. There's been significant change at installations, and one of the issues is we recognize that change in the fact that we're not focusing the master plan on today's current mission. So oftentimes people will say, we don't need a vision because we already have it. Here's our mission. You know, we're going to do this, this, and that. And then I ask them, well, how recently has that changed? Well, probably last year it changed. So the idea is, yes, we need to address today's known mission, certainly. But we also need to understand that missions will change over time. And at Joint Base Lewis McChord, this certainly has been the case. And they're moving into different mission sets. And the idea is that the flexibility of the plan, and this gets to that strategy of the form-based planning, where we have that illustrative plan that illustrates one way to achieve the vision, but underneath of that is the regulating plan that gives a lot of flexibility to folks in terms of moving forward with different development patterns, different repurposing strategies. So the flexibility comes in at the regulating plan level. The master plan itself, with all these documents, pretty big thing. But the most helpful piece, I've asked the planner there, Tom Tolman, who's a great guy, and he's really kind of led the effort. And he said, Mark, the most helpful thing to me has been an 11 by 17 package, about 20 pages or so, of just the regulating plans. Because what he's able to do is go to all these people that have different missions and changing requirements, and he can say, well, here's what we're thinking for on this piece of land or for this facility, and here are the rules, and if you want to bring some money or if you want to do something, here's how it works. And it's made his job a heck of a lot easier. It's allowed the flexibility that's needed to accommodate mission changes, but it's made sure that that's consistent with the long-term vision of the installation.
Picking up on some of that a little bit, and again, home to the Washington area issues, many agencies are looking to expand telework to meet sustainability and mission goals. How is DOD using telework and other flexible scheduling approaches? What seems to be working well, and where have you found challenges? So is there any accommodation or space in these regulations or similar for these types of maybe non-built environment solutions?
I just mentioned the telework that we're doing in our different SCIF facilities, and I think that's going to work very well for us. It's more of less of a facility design and more of a facility management approach. The pitfall that you have to watch for is people will like to have an office in each building. And then all of a sudden you lose your efficiency. But our drive is trying to get people to be able to work from the location that's nearest to their home, so then that cuts down the transportation costs and helps us in that way. So that's really the only pitfall I've come across. The other thing I would mention too, it came up earlier, but the size of facilities. I learned this when I first came here about 10 years ago and talking to Mike on some other projects. And as an architect, when you're designing facilities and you think of a organization that might have 2,000 people, And if the program requirement starts with that the standard workstation is 8 by 10 or 10 by 10, and all of a sudden you multiply that times the number of people, and then you take all the overhead space required because they are all factored up, and use that model versus a model of what you really need, and it may only be a 6 by 8 workstation times 2,000 people, that's a huge difference in square footage. And so we are in our buildings to be able to do telework, making sure that we're coming down that, and our standard is 7.5 by 5.5 with an open area so the analysts can work around a round table, 4 of them. And that model works very well for us, but it's tightened up greatly our requirements for space and allows us the telework.
GSA, of course, has been incredibly aggressive in moving toward this concept of hoteling. I don't think we're not anywhere near where GSA is. It's a different workforce. I think it depends on the workforce. For my staff, I'm not wild about telework, to be honest. I think it. I think I'm probably not supposed to say that. No, what I mean, because it is the policy to allow it, but I mean, I think that the nature of their jobs, I think it helps to have them there. A lot of information gets exchanged, you know, at the water cooler or whatever. So I think it's very much an office specific thing, but it clearly, I think part of the reason we're not seeing the impact at the Mark Center is people are taking advantage of teleworking. I mean, there aren't, the number of people who show up at the Mark Center on a given day is a much smaller fraction of the total who are assigned there than we imagined, and some of that is travel, but some of that is telework.
I'm going to take maybe one more question from the sheet here, and then we'll maybe try and wrap it up and have some concluding statements so we get people out of here on time. The next one is sort of jump in your time machine a little bit, and if we were redoing some major facilities in the Washington area, again, those are the ones I'm most familiar with, but if there's one out there elsewhere, if we were rebuilding the Pentagon, if we were doing the BRAC round and the Mark Center, how might the UFC influence things differently? So just put on your speculation hat, and that's always hard to do. But how might this apply to future big projects that are tough, where you're moving people or you're changing behaviors or there's culture change in the facility or the military, culture change in the community? How might this improve things going forward? Maybe that'll be our wrap-up question, and then maybe some final comments from each of the panelists.
Well, I guess I don't work for the DoD, so I can say this. I don't think there should have been a Mark Center. The issue of trying to move a bunch of folks for security reasons that are somewhat manufactured into an area that has no access to transit is simply a bad idea. There are other ways to address that problem without a new building. But many people like to build new buildings under their watch. You know, it's a nice thing. That's an accomplishment that they've had. And I think the UFC, if it would have been done at the time, could have been used to say, let's look to other strategies, perhaps less expensive strategies, to solve the security problem, because a new building isn't always going to solve our problem. I think the approach at the Pentagon is a better one. Actually, the Pentagon is a pretty nice model. It has some narrow wings, there's some light going into the Pentagon. Certainly it's in an area well served by transit. It's multiple stories, so it has a lot of these ideas embedded into it. I think the only flaw in there is that the jobs housing balance, and that's starting to be addressed by some development across the interstate from the Pentagon, but the idea of thinking about how it can be integrated more into an area where that jobs housing balance could be better done, I think would be appropriate. But one of the things I enjoy about the U.S. Navy is the Navy lives in everything we're talking about on their ships every day. Their ships are multi-story, mixed use, compact, infill. They do everything right on their ships. And it's really taking that model to the installation level, to the shore, and saying, hey, we do it here on our ships and our subs, and we've had great participation from folks on the submarines, folks on the ships, working with us to learn lessons from the Navy on how that can be applied. So I certainly think there are opportunities to start to reconsider And I especially am hopeful if there is another round of BRAC, because Dorothy's absolutely right, that does come with shifted missions and new requirements, that we start to see that next round planning be done more effectively following a clear vision of where installations want to go.
I would say my wife was not interested in living on my ship, but, but the ship is a good model. I think, and for my part, really the security piece, as to your question, I think post 9/11 there was a lot of immediate reaction, and that always drives people to extremes. And like you said early on, the designer said, well, if this is a requirement, we're a much more important organization, so we're going to increase that requirement, and I'm going to please my commander because we're more protected than anybody else. Or another one we used to use is other people will be a softer target, we'll be a harder target. But I think the refinement of the security criteria is really going to help us greatly.
Thank you. And the last quick question, when and where is the UFC available for folks to?
Available now?
Okay.
What's the website? It's the whole building design guide. And that will be put out, we can put out some information.
Okay, we'll work through staff to get information out either through the NCPC website or through email. Let me ask our panelists any last comment or question or something that you really wanted to get out there that we didn't have a chance to answer all of the great questions that we had from folks, but appreciate that. Those that had good penmanship generally got asked first. So if I had to squint to read it, a little harder. But any final comments?
Well, I think I could talk a bit about process for a minute. That in the creation of the document, 18 months is a pretty quick process to get a major transformation through in a UFC. And the way we did that was in a very collaborative approach, where we actually followed the planning process in creating the planning document. And for that, I want to thank Jerry. Thad has certainly been a major part of this, and Mike. But the idea is we began with a vision of, what do we want this to be? And that was started in Eugene and continued the conversation in San Antonio and then here in Washington, D.C. So we followed that process. That's called the identification phase, where we identify our vision, goals, and objectives. And then that's followed by the analysis phase, where we're not analyzing places, but we're analyzing plans and documents. So we actually went through and analyzed the previous UFC, different agency guidance, different approaches, best practices, and kind of a very collaborative approach. And then following the analysis phase, there's the design phase. And we actually went through and designed the document. And then we sent that document out for tremendous rounds of review. I think this might be, Thad, one of the ones that had some of the most collaborative review processes around. And in part, that's because planning is about collaboration. Planning stretches across many disciplines. So the idea is the document went out, and we had over 700 review comments. All of them were addressed in one way or the other. We had multiple webinars where we were educating people on the process. Jerry and Andrew Kuhn from the Corps of Engineers. We've been out to the American Planning Association, both in Boston last year and in Los Angeles this year, socializing it with consulting planners and federal planners and getting their input on the process and making changes accordingly. We've been teaching that for 2 years, and many of our courses are proponent-sponsored engineering curriculum training courses for the Army Corps of Engineers. So the idea is that, I didn't invent this, Jerry didn't invent this. This has been something that's been brought up from the field in an approach that uses participatory planning in the creation of a regulation, which I think is pretty revolutionary in and of itself. And it's in that fashion that we're able to, I think, get this thing through in a period of 18 months.
Congratulations, and please thank our panel. I think that brings us to the close of the program. I want to thank the NCPC team, certainly Chairman Preston Bryan, Marcel Acosta, Julia, and the entire NCPC staff. I'm sure they will find a way to reach out and share follow-up information with you, and have a good day and safe travel back wherever you're going. Thank you.